let me introduce you. And for the people who are participating and our audience, I'm Lee Miringoff, and I direct the Marist Institute for Public Opinion. And Kathryn Rivera, a recent alum, the famous class, which will ever be known as the class of 2020, will be presenting her honors thesis momentarily. I'm going to introduce her. Then Katie has a PowerPoint she's going to go through and explain what her research was all about. And then I'm going to ask a couple questions. And then if anybody has just use the chat feature, we will see that. And I will then, sort of put you into the discussion. At least I will be your mouthpiece for that. This is organized, and we want to thank Becky Selmeyer, who's put this together, as she's done other, and this is the Red Fox Summer Connect program, or is it Reconnect? But anyway, I guess if you don't know, it says Connect, and if you do, it's a Reconnect. But anyway, so we're happy to have the opportunity to keep Marist remotely going, and we are adjusting to the climate we find ourselves in. But let me introduce Katie. Katie is a rare student. She was a double major at Marist, both in political science and math. We were just talking before the program about how she was one of the students selected to go to New Hampshire for the presidential primaries, which was only like 4 months ago, which now feels like 2 or 3 years ago. At that point, we had already done one national survey on the virus, which no one knew anything about or cared. We saw a presentation, a rally of President Trump while we were up there, and that was when he was calling it a hoax and all those things. Excuse me. Katie is right now in El Paso, Texas, where she lives. And I've actually had the opportunity to see Mom when we were doing her research. And so she has a great supportive family, which allowed her or encouraged her to go far and wide as she hopped in a car and went all the way to Poughkeepsie, New York, to study at Marist. She was right now has been what was an internship turned into a position because the intern program at Global Strategies was eliminated because of the virus. And what's happened is that turned out to be a position for Katie. So she's actually an election assistant right now with Global Strategies, which is a huge survey research operation which does a lot of politics and all kinds of things. Both for corporations and market research and surveys and all that. And so then they have literally tossed her in as a newbie employee, but starting out with doing some great things. However, the agenda for tonight is about what she did as an honor student and her research, which she's going to talk about. It dealt primarily with the 2020 election, starting in the primary, and obviously events have dramatically changed since then. But she's put together a PowerPoint, and then we can talk about some of the findings and some of the implications. So I turn it over to you, Katie, and I'm delighted to be able to do this, and I'm delighted by what your work was at Marist, and even probably more delighted about what you're doing now at Global Strategies. But anyway, so Katie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am so honored and very excited to be able to participate. Just a quick thank you to both you, Dr. Miringoff, for advising me on my thesis, and also thank you to James Snyder for inviting me to be a part of the series. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so I can show my PowerPoint.
Are you trying to load it? There we are.
Okay, can everyone see now?
Yeah. I can. I assume others can as well.
Okay. So the name of my presentation is the 2020 presidential election, the analysis of convergent democratic political strategies. My question is, based on the 2016 presidential election, the 2018 midterm election, and the current primary season, which strategy should Democrats use to fortify their party and solidify their voter base to clinch a victory in 2020? This is obviously not a new question. It's just how the Democrats win this election. The 2020 presidential election obviously was set to be special just because of the ideological issues with the Trump administration, but also because he is a kind of president we've never really seen before. For those of you who don't know, Donald Trump clinched the presidency in a huge upset against Hillary Clinton, who was projected to win in essentially every iteration, every poll leading up to the election. During the campaign season, we saw a rise of what we now call Trumpian Republicans. This rhetoric kind of surrounded the idea that a silent majority of the US was so heavily discontent with the Obama era. We're looking for someone who was outside of the establishment, who would represent real America, who was more honest, and that would be shown through political correctness, like the lack thereof, political correctness, and also just kind of like a pompous hubris that feels more relatable to American people. After the 20 candidates registered as Democrats to run for president, I think all of us thought that our primary season was going to be far more contentious than it ended up being. After so many, I think 3 or 4 candidates dropped out before Super Tuesday, which is typically the date that candidates and their campaigns can assess how well or how poorly they've done, and then decide to continue the campaign or terminate their campaign. That just didn't come to fruition. After so many of these candidates dropped out and then endorsed Joe Biden, much of the middle left eventually just consolidated, many endorsed Joe Biden, and led to what most people had anticipated before all of these candidates registered to run, is that Joe Biden would become the presumptive Democratic nominee. So my theory is based off of 2 paths towards the nomination, the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt. So obviously there are more than one way to win elections, but many political scientists and analysts see the Democratic Party moving in these one of 2 ways, either focusing on a more diverse population that is growing in the Sun Belt, or move towards capturing moderate voters to a more centrist approach in the Rust Belt. So in key Rust Belt states that Trump captured in 2016, his job approval rating that 2018 was consistently worse than his national average among whites with and without a college degree. So this suggests that most of the straightforward path for Democrats to recapture these states, in particular, I looked at Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, may be to nominate someone who can reassure white voters who are losing faith in their 2016 decisions. In the Sun Belt, most states that Democrats are hoping to contest, by contrast, Trump's approval rating among both college and non-college educated white voters exceeds his national average. This suggests that to flip these targets, and the states that I looked at were Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina, Democrats must find a nominee who can mobilize a much greater turnout among the state's large and growing demographic of non-white voters and also younger voters. And so for my analysis, I chose to look at these 2 proposed roads to the win. So why would I look at these 2 areas? And I think what a lot of people are very confused about when I talk about the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt is that because of the differences are not just geographical, because of geographical difference, there are also demographic differences. So with beckoning economies, warm weather, and inexpensive land, which much of the Sun Belt is looking a much more attractive place for Americans to move, and where growing families plan to stay. The Sun Belt shows to have growth in demographics that count the most Democrats, which are college-educated whites and Hispanics. And so I chose the 3 states within the Sun Belt that are often considered key states for this election. Then with the Rust Belt, it's a land of dying industrial jobs, and which created a coalition that many analysts understand to have handed Donald Trump his presidential win in 2016. Workers, unionists, and white non-college educated voters that are disillusioned with globalization and socially liberal policies being pushed in other areas of the country by Democratic politicians proved to be a strong voter base, often flipping elections in their favor due largely to just better voter turnout. So for my research design, I tried to pick something very concise and easy to understand. And so I chose a paired t-test to compare 2 population means, where you have 2 samples in which observations in one sample can be paired with observations in another sample. So this is used in samples that are before and after observations of the same subjects, and a comparison of 2 different methods of measurement or treatments, where the measurements or treatments are applied to the same subject. While this test is typically used for unchanged samples, I know that not everyone that voted in either of these elections, either 2016 or 2018, is not exactly paired to the people who have voted in past or in future elections. But what I'm treating the sample as is the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, and then the treatment over the 4-year period being the Trump presidency. So we look at 3 parties, Democrat, Republican, third party. I did not compare third party against them because they were very, very small sample sizes, and so the results would have been like largely negligible. Then for the presidential election, I compared the presidential election results from 2016 compared to 2020 public opinion data from March and April. The reason why I used the election data and public opinion data is obviously because the 2020 election has not happened yet, but also because Joe Biden's approval is essentially, and is polling at essentially the same rate that Hillary Clinton was poised to win, and also the margins in which she actually did win the popular vote. And then for the Congressional House of Representatives, the average percentage of party votes from 2016 to 2018, and then percentage of party votes for Senate 2016 to 2018. However, Michigan did not have a Senate election in 2016, and Florida did not have one in 2018. So the averages are based off of the average of 5 states instead of 6, but they do match each other at the same end value. So that's what I ended up doing. So here are my results for the Rust Belt. Here, the Republican Party, you can see the red circle. While not below the 0.5 p-value threshold, it's nearly significant change in Republican voters for president from 2016 to 2018. When looking at the data percentages, it appears that Republican support for the presidential of the president has increased. Then if you look at the Democratic Party with the red circle around it, there is significant change in Democratic voting in the House of Representatives. Looking at individual data, it appears that there's increased Democratic voting, which you can tell by the negative p-value. Now in the Sun Belt, you can see in these 2 red circles on the Republican Party, the p-value for the House difference is, as well as for the presidency, which falls slightly above the 0.15, but looking at the data, it appears that there is a decrease in Republican voting in these 2 categories, which is really meaningful. And on the Democratic side, you can see that the p-value is 0.69, so it's not exactly significant, but it is indicative that there is a slight increase in Democratic support for president. So what that means is in the Rust Belt, while for Republicans, for a Republican president, presumably Donald Trump, which is looking like that is also a certainty, is waning. The result is not significant enough to warrant alarm or really any analysis. It appears, however, there may be greater interest in the Rust Belt for Democratic local representatives. So while I was cutting down the data for my analysis, in Michigan, I found that it has a much higher margin of third-party choices on the ballot for the House of Representatives than any other state that I tested. And so I did some further digging, and what it is many of the polls that I read through, so that people in this area believe that they have very unique interests that are not necessarily being represented by either major party. And so they are looking for parties that more specifically cater to them. Lots of very interesting party data for Michigan. Now in the Sun Belt, with more significant results, it appears that both in the House from 2016 to 2018 and presidential races from 2016 to 2020, there appears to be a dwindling support for the Republican Party in the Sun Belt, which is my most significant result. And for the Democratic Party, there appears to be a small but not significant surge in the Democratic voice House voters, while both the president and senatorial p-values do not indicate a significant difference when looking at the specific data. The whole Democratic voting pattern seems to be trending positively. And so I got a lot of questions about this when I was working on my project. People saying, like, how meaningful is this really when you look at what happened in 2016 with the polls with Hillary Clinton? I thought it was really important to say that I think this poll is from late April. That Joe Biden is essentially polling at the same rate that Hillary Clinton was polling at during that time in 2016. And so this does not dictate what would be the most certain road, but it will dictate what the sentiments will be in a much longer string of events. I could have brought my analysis back from 2014, 2012. However, when I was cutting down my data, I had to cut it down from counts of votes and then normalize that. And so it took a very, very long time to cut down and make my own databases. But I do think that in the future, that would be a meaningful test to run. So my conclusion essentially was that the implications of the data show that there may lie a more viable pathway for Democrats through the Sun Belt. Joe Biden's campaign has continuously championed the modern agenda, getting to an older, more traditional Democrat base with key demographics that Dems are looking to capture, such as the Southern Black community and moderates in the Midwest, looking for security and stability after the events of 2020. So I actually, while I do believe that there lies a more viable pathway for Democrats through the Sun Belt, I do expect them to pursue the Rust Belt to capture Donald Trump's disillusioned base, was weary of him and not delivering on all of the promises that he ran on for his campaign in 2016. So this is all of the additional portions of my paper I had to think about and add in after I had thought about all of the things that had happened after school was, abruptly ended in March, and then also all of the candidates dropped out before Super Tuesday endorsed Joe Biden. All of these continual new factors that would alter the election in November this is the one that was most obvious to me at first. So Joe Biden is a mitigating factor. The candidate obviously matters when it comes to presidential elections. Many thought Biden was finished after New Hampshire. In many of the debates, he stumbled through sentences, called into question his mental and physical health, and that, frankly, has not stopped since the pandemic. We see him less, but he's also doing these press conferences from home. So a lot of that is pretty highly controlled and also can be edited. So that has not really been fixed or addressed, rather. Additionally, Joe Biden faced a sexual assault allegation during his time as state senator. The accusation that became public in March 2020 involves Tara Reid, a former intern for Biden in 1993. However, the opinion is on the accusation is truly divided. Approximately 37% say the allegation is probably true, while 32% say it's probably not true, and 31% of people having just no opinion on it. But within the group that says the accusation against Biden is probably true, he still wins 1 in 3 of those people's votes. So the effects of this allegation have yet to be seen, as other national issues have severely minimized the coverage on it. I believe that it will eventually become a focal issue when the debate time comes against Donald Trump. We saw the same thing happen to Hillary Clinton with her emails during the debates, became a focal issue only because Donald Trump knew how to wield that kind of like negative social capital against them.
Mm-hmm.
The next one is obviously COVID-19. So when I was proposing this issue in the fall of 2019, I couldn't have foreseen what was going to happen. Every aspect of life is changed and has been altered, meaning that the presidential election will also be altered significantly. So after losing employment and subsequently their health care, many people, regardless of party identification, actually agreed with Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All proposal, but it did not at all change his numbers and eventually led to him dropping out of the race. So when you compare the US counties that had reported a confirmed case of COVID-19 prior to voting to similar counties where COVID-19 appeared only after votes were cast, there was a noted flight to safety of voters towards Joe Biden and away from Senator Sanders. Additionally, ideological shifts will not necessarily account for the change in political participation this election compared to the logistical issues linked to voting during this pandemic. We've already seen these issues arise in Illinois, which caused a significant rise in coronavirus cases and deaths after voters ventured to the polls in mid-March, which now is a very long time ago as compared to there's been so many primaries since. But many politicians have championed mail-in ballots initiatives to ensure that those who do not want to risk infection can still participate. But as we've seen also, this issue was quickly politicized as a potential voter fraud by conservatives and is still very, very contentious. And one of the main questions that is being polled right now, whether or not people feel safe sending their ballots away, whether they think it is a viable way for them to vote, what kind of issues they might see, whether they think their vote will be counted or it will be over-counted. It's just essentially all a matter of opinion, even though there are numbers and facts that indicate that it is very safe in a certain way to vote by mail. And then the last mitigating factor that I think many people anticipate will bring about changes in November, but I think not the changes that many are expecting to see. So obviously for those who don't know, in February in 2020, a black man named Ahmaud Arbery was shot by two white men while jogging, and the news of his murder, even though it was caught on tape, was not picked up by the media until months later. This, coupled with Breonna Taylor being killed in her bed by police and a viral video of George Floyd being suffocated to death for 9 minutes by Minneapolis PD, led to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and possibly the largest social movement in history. So most American voters support the demonstrations against police brutality and racial injustice that have sprawled across the country. However, the majority of American voters do not support calls to defund the police. 59% of voters, including 52% of white voters, believe the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police in Minneapolis was a part of a broader pattern of excessive police violence toward African Americans. The Black Lives Matter movement and the police have had similar favorability ratings, however, with 44% of registered voters having a very favorable view of the movement and an almost identical 43% rating for the police. A survey of battleground states critical to November's election largely mirrored the national results. So 54% of voters in those states said that the way the criminal justice system treats Black Americans was a bigger problem than the incidence of rioting seen in some of the demonstrations. But just 37% said the rioting was a bigger problem, though Mr. Trump and allies have tried to discredit the protests by focusing on these isolated incidents of violence. Along with the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, we've also seen a large uptick in the Blue Lives Matter kind of support of police. Something I wanted to note only because recently the New York Times put out an article that had an infographic about how Black Lives Matter is the most popular social justice movement that has happened over the years, and they showed the net favorability going from a negative favorability to like a large positive is because of the shooting in July of 2016 at the Black Lives Matter protest for Alton Sterling and Philando Castillo, where 5 police officers were killed, and then kind of spurred this large Blue Lives Matter movement, which is now, I'd say, definitely more popular, but not even close to as popular as Black Lives Matter. Most people tend to agree with both, even though they have contradictory ideas. But those are the largest mitigating factors, I think, that will really affect my analysis, but also just affect not just this coming presidential election, all the local elections, but all of them that span past that, and will definitely trickle into 2022, 2024. And yeah.
Good. Thank you, Katie, for that. I have a couple questions and a couple comments, and then in the audience, if people want to join, please use your chat button to do that, and I will be your voice to talk to Katie if you have any questions about this. I must say that was very, it was interesting in a lot of ways. First of all, I was surprised in your map of the Sun Belt that you have San Antonio as the place in Texas and not El Paso, where you're from. And I wondered if there was any, message that I should read into that, or it's just the way it fell.
Of Texas tend to leave El Paso out, mostly because most people think it's actually in New Mexico.
But not.
I know.
Okay. So seriously though, we were up in New Hampshire for the presidential primary, as I mentioned in the introduction, and actually attended a Trump rally where he was talking about this all being a hoax. And after that, everything just blew up, and the politics did as well. And you, by way of comment, you had identified that Joe Biden was really not looking viable, despite Democrats seeing electability as being a major force, but there were a lot of sort of candidates in the middle who conceivably could have emerged unlike him. One of the people I talked to said that Biden finished fourth in Iowa, third in New Hampshire, second in Nevada, and then finally first in South Carolina. So if you had bet early that it would be a 4-3-2-1, you would have made a lot of money out of that. But I think the important thing is that you identified it as for the primary dynamic at that point was that it coalesced around the Biden candidacy, and I think you point out in the paper how much COVID, or you've talked today about how much COVID-19 created that, what you call the flight to safety. And I'm wondering if you feel, in retrospect, that really worked against some of the more progressive arguments that were being advanced by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and others, because COVID-19 came on, and it just changed the dynamic away from big ideas to let's just get a little security here, and in what you call the flight to safety. So I just want you to explore the COVID-19 phenomena as you saw it, and what that did for the Democratic contest.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting seeing him in New Hampshire. I remember coming back and feeling like everything had been so clear for me afterwards. Donald Trump, I didn't go to the Trump rally. I instead went to the Bernie rally, which was incredibly full. I think they were close to capacity. They had the Strokes, they had AOC there, Cornel West. It was full of life and energy, and really felt like everyone was excited to be there, really believed in the message. And then seeing Joe Biden, even at the debate, was shocking almost to see the difference in energy, and also just I don't know what the word is for it, but just like his capabilities seemed like they were just turned all the way down, and was not prepared for it. And so looking at the polling during the primary season, when Bernie Sanders was winning a plurality of these contests, and then to see that a head-to-head from Bernie to Trump, Bernie was winning, and then also see all of these other moderate candidates drop out, move to endorse Biden, and Biden almost immediately overcame. It's also seeing that Bloomberg was a large mitigating factor for a Bernie win was very surprising, only because of the people that we met in New Hampshire, and also the actual demeanors of the candidates. I think that going into this time, this flight to safety has more to do with what people believe to be feasible, instead of moving to a candidate that they know would provide them Medicare for all. People felt as though, you know what, I'll just take what I have right now and try and do my best with it, and then hold out for maybe just a slightly better version of this with Joe Biden, because the odds of Joe Biden winning, everyone expected to be better, easier, more accessible for them. When if really there was any time that this election could become like a one-issue election, would be a massive health crisis, where people could say, this is the one thing we care about, and this is what we want. It's Medicare for all. This is how we're all going to stay safe, provide ourselves these things. Really, really interesting to me that everyone just thought, you know, I'm going to protect, my family by trying to keep my health insurance in this way, and then move closer to Biden. It makes a lot of sense when you think about how Americans think about that, but then when they started losing jobs, and jobs that were dependent on their health care and vice versa, there just became, instead of like belief in Biden, just a complete dissatisfaction and also disillusionment with the system that they bought into in the first place.
And you really didn't, obviously the paper didn't deal with this because of the timing of it, but clearly in South Carolina was the first time there was a majority vote of people of color, and how much that meant as going into Super Tuesday, and provided that springboard for Biden. That really was the end of it, and of the battle for all intents and purposes. But I think that your paper really lays the foundation for that kind of subtlety in terms of where the Democratic Party was, even if a lot of it was conceived before the events unfolded. And one thing I think that I'm just fascinated by, and I wanted to talk about this moving forward, in your paper, although you talk about the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt as sort of the two strategies for the Democrats, and conclude in your analysis that Joe Biden is more likely to try to rebuild the blue wall in the industrial Midwest rather than to branch out in the Sun Belt, which is what your analysis showed, and in fact is now occurring from your paper. So I thought that was very, very insightful in that you identified that the Rust Belt was the place he would be, and certainly he's looking to rebuild that core support in that area. I guess the question is, do you think that, because the Sun Belt's going to get a lot of attention, do you think that Biden is just trying to sort of secure his base before he branches out more into places like Florida and Arizona and maybe Texas? Or do you think they're just going to drive that industrial Midwest strategy home, recognizing that if he wins Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and the states that Hillary Clinton carried, he doesn't have to win anything else. So those three would do it for him. So I just wanted, that's a long way of sort of getting you to comment on the on how insightful you were, and also what you think the Biden team is up to.
I think the reason why I kind of put that prediction in there is because it just feels like who he is, and what he wanted to do, and who he just speaks to on a basic level. I do think that Democrats rightly assess that Trump is not going to have a bigger win than he did in 2016. And I do believe that they are just going to drive this home. It doesn't feel like a last-ditch effort just yet, but it does feel as though they're just like holding on to any voter that they can get. And most voters right now are feeling so heavily disillusioned. And even though many people don't really believe in this, return to normalcy, they feel as though Biden is part of the same establishment that Trump is essentially, that doesn't really matter at this point because everyone feels so detached, disillusioned with all these systems, feel failed by them. COVID is exposed not only obviously the flaws in our healthcare system, but also the flaws in our schools, access to food, voting, all of these huge disparities that couldn't have been worsened any more really than through a global pandemic. And so I think people just want what many people believe, an adult in the White House, which I think is an interesting way to characterize Joe Biden. I think it's also interesting. He's also polling pretty high in terms of capabilities. You know, they think he's like mentally stable and stuff, which happens to be like the one large concern really that people have had with this person in the last couple of months. But it's only because people think Donald Trump is even more kind of off his rocker in a more serious way. And so I don't think Joe Biden is going to be the candidate to reach out past anything that is like a sure win. A lot of people are expecting Trump to win his base, maybe in counties or in constituencies by larger margins, but not at all largely without or like widespread in the country. Instead, very condensed so that he would be able to get the representatives that he needs to get to 270.
Yeah, Katie, can I just encourage you to take off your screen because we're seeing a lot of screen and you are not as large as you should be. So if you could to eliminate that, that would help. But no, I think that these are interesting points, and I think that there's something to be said for. There you go. Thank you. There's something to be said for the some people who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, and responding to kind of like a change message and an economic populism, although very differently defined, and whether Biden can be successful in targeting that group in that region, building off of the Scranton roots, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly in a world of targeting, that seems like something that would be a group that, you know, could hold just that slight balance in those three states, because those numbers were very close in 2016. And as you say, there's the expectation of the president doing better than he did as an incumbent rather than as a challenger, given what's going on, seems a bit of a stretch. Do you see that? I've been torn by this as well, whether the Rust Belt or the Sun Belt is the best, and that's how we got into this paper originally. Do you feel that the Biden campaign will, eventually be much more into, let's say, Florida, where seniors are very upset about the reopening of the economy at the expense of healthcare, for example, and whether that might be something that Biden can build off of? Because obviously, if Florida goes to Biden, that it doesn't mean a lot more than that. But I don't know, do you think this is a recognizing that the industrial Midwest, the Rust Belt, is the place that he can secure his situation? Do you think he then looks south because there is some potential to pick up votes?
No, absolutely. I have been seeing that both personally while listening to actual, discussion boards or polls and like consuming that data, that people are so outraged about healthcare right now, and outraged at their local politicians, people who are running either for the first time or again about their stance on healthcare is a huge dictating factor on whether or not they believe that they should vote for them. And I think after this week, with Florida's cases, I think it is the highest cases, I think, in the world. I'm not sure, but I believe that's true.
South Korea has had during the entire period.
So yes, after this, having the economy reopened, same thing with Arizona, two places where they've done a very, very, very poor job of reopening or allowing things to stay open for much longer than they should have, makes it all seem so much more real, especially with Florida, and that has an aging population. That's going to be a huge hit to them. People who already vote by mail aren't really a part of this conversation about like whether or not it's a good idea. People who vote at higher rates which is exactly the same demographic of people, and
Mm-hmm.
people whose number one priority is healthcare. I do think that even if they do kind of hunker down and focus on the Midwest, I think this pandemic, especially like being in the position that Joe Biden is in, he's going to pick up a lot more votes supporting Medicare, Medicaid, just on like on a basic level. He doesn't even have to champion it; just has to say, this is important. We have to fund it. And most people will believe that is the best answer that could come of it.
Well, let's play out one scenario going down, somewhere, let's say in October. There's a sense perhaps that, because right now, as long as the coronavirus stays top of mind for people and Donald Trump looks like he dropped the ball, it's going to be very hard for Trump to be reelected. And I think that's why Biden has this lead right now. But let's say there's a sense that whether it's real or not, that there's a treatment or a vaccine around the corner, and people feel less anxious about the virus. And then there's a sense perhaps that because we reopened, although that caused all kinds of healthcare problems, that maybe the economy, unemployment starts, the numbers start descending a little bit, and maybe there's some sense in the future that could work. And I know the president's numbers are better on handling the economy than they are elsewhere. So having put that scenario in, if that were the best case for Donald Trump's reelection, the fear of the virus going away, a sense that the economy is improving, does Joe Biden's projection of empathy, civility, does that get past those Republicans, or does it attract Republicans who are exhausted, as you said, in the Midwest with Donald Trump? That how do you see that dynamic playing out?
I think the most interesting thing to come out of this is that most people don't blame Donald Trump for his handling of the coronavirus, even though it is directly linked to his handling of the coronavirus. It's seen as kind of like out of hand, not really his fault. I think that the one thing that Joe Biden has over Donald Trump is that people view him as more refined, more intellectual, because of being tied to the Obama administration, an administration that was many believe to as being like the classiest or the most aspirational kind of presidency that there could be. And so that plays a lot into the character of Donald Trump and definitely works against them. There's so many people who voted for Trump in 2016 that feel like his behavior is unacceptable, but maybe he stands for something that they believe in, or that they don't really like him, and they thought there was going to be more, he was going to do better, he was going to really deliver on these campaign promises, unlike typical politicians, and still feel as though he hasn't really grown into the position regardless of those things. So I do think that it will help help Joe Biden in this case. I also can't see a lot of things. I was even thinking about the Black Lives Matter protest, is that Donald Trump is being seen very negatively, but for two distinct reasons. One being obviously he's not doing enough to quell racial inequality. He hasn't passed any meaningful, social legislation. In fact, he's like taking away freedoms. All of these things that most people have seen. Also viewed very negatively by conservatives who do not believe he has done enough to stop these protests or stop the rioting or looting, or did not do enough to punish the people for doing these things. And so he's getting negative reviews from even his own base on something like that. Even though it's very negative for Donald Trump in that right, it's also not necessarily mapping to a positive trend for Joe Biden. People don't necessarily see him as the opposite to Donald Trump, but instead, you know, a moderate who will allow things like this to happen won't actively move against it. And so instead of there being, you know, one directly feeding into the other, more of a middle ground of people saying, oh, I don't really know what I want to do or what I want to say. And so I kind of imagine in an October situation, there's going to be a lot more undecided, not sures, not voting before November comes.
Well, it's going to get very nasty, as would certainly not be surprising. What I'm struck by also, and we're going to wrap up in a couple seconds, but what I'm struck by also is, you know, in President Trump's, to borrow Ron Brownstein's expression, is support of the politics of restoration, the going back to a white base, although the country is changing, and certainly Barack Obama, as you said, represented the politics of the ascendant, groups that are, you know, moving up, and that tension between the two. I'm not sure that this election is going to be as much of the ascendancy as it may be Donald Trump revving up a shrinking base. And he seems to be trying to get a smaller group even more unhappy with the status quo or whatever. It's just, I guess that's just the way he's playing it. It seems not necessarily the best strategy, but it, you know, it seems consistent with, you know, the difficulties his own staff are having to keep hot message, and maybe wanting him to do a few things a little bit differently. I know this has been a great discussion, and I thank you for that. I know you're not allowed to give great detail on what your current job is because you're working this is not a transparent world when you're working in campaign development strategy, but you know, you left Marist when we all did in March and then graduated in May, and now find yourself at this very interesting position. Maybe you could share just a little bit of the kind of skills that you're applying to this position, and a little bit, without divulging any confidences, obviously, about the kinds of things you're involved with right now. I think people would find that interesting.